Alright, pretty simple premise for a video. Here are 3 horror novels that I just finished reading. You might not have read them, you might not have heard of them, and I think they're worth your time, so let's talk about them. This is Hex by Thomas Olderhoevelt. It's a Dutch horror novel. Now, I've read a lot of horror novels, and I've read quite a few Dutch novels, and I've spent a lot of time in the Netherlands, as my Dutch travel videos show. But I've never read a Dutch horror novel. This was translated amazingly into English by Nancy Forrest Flyer, and Forrest Flyer is one of the greatest hyphenated names I've ever come across. Hex is really, really great. It is a very, very unique premise for a horror novel. I will say up front that I didn't find it out and out scary at any point, but it is certainly creepy. And the creepiness amps up as it goes. It starts off almost laughing at the idea of horror and creepiness. It subverts all expectations, and then it grows in creepiness, and at the exact halfway point, things go absolutely batshit insane. So it's a novel that kind of plays with your feelings, it plays with your expectations, it plays with tropes, it plays around a lot, and I really respect it for that. Hex is set in the modern day in a small town in the Hudson Valley in upstate New York, a place that I actually lived for a few months. It's a beautiful, beautiful part of the world, one of my favorite areas of the United States that I've been to. Honestly, I could retire to the Hudson Valley, it's gorgeous. But this small town is pretty unique. It is haunted by the ghost of a witch. The ghost is real, and everyone knows her. When she was alive, her name was Catherine Van Wyler. She was a woman who lived in this town. She was accused of witchcraft, and she died in the 1660s. Ever since then, her ghost has roamed this town and done pretty predictable things. She has a route, she has a path, she has specific behaviors that people have gotten used to. And for hundreds of years, in secret, she's been haunting this town. She just roams the streets and sometimes even makes her way into people's homes, where she will just stand in the corner of their living room looking creepy and watching them while they sleep, and everyone's used to it. There have been a handful of cases over the last few hundred years, once every 50 years or so, where people try to experiment with her and figure her out and do something that she doesn't like. For example, her eyes and mouth are stitched shut. This happened to her before she died, and she walks around blind and mute. And one time, about 50 years ago, some people tied her up because she's kind of corporeal, she can be touched. They tied her up and they tried to snip open the stitches of her mouth. And they managed to snip just one in the corner of her mouth. And it turns out that when you get too close to her, she can kind of telepathically talk to you and convince you to do really dark things. She injects depression into you. And people who get too close and start listening to that voice that she emits will end up taking their own lives. And she can even cause people to just drop dead in the streets. She has caused aneurysms and strokes out of nowhere. So she's a force to be reckoned with. But what's interesting is this town keeps her a secret from everyone outside. They've been doing this for a long, long time. If you live in this town, you are part of an agreement that you don't talk about this ghost to outsiders. When the internet started becoming a thing, they built a kind of firewall. Like, I used to live in China, and if you don't know, China has what they call the Great Firewall, which means that a lot of websites are just banned in China. Almost all Western social media just doesn't work there, and this town has kind of the same thing. They have a lot of freedoms taken away from them by a kind of local council, all in service of keeping her a secret. But the premise of the book is basically this. There's a group of teenagers who've grown up in this town, and they've decided to kind of experiment with this ghost. And one of the first things they do is move a lamppost into her usual path, and she bumps into it and falls down, and they record it happening. It's absolutely fascinating. The way that Thomas Olderhoevelt has played with the concept of hauntings and a local ghost, and kind of local mythology, is absolutely fantastic. I had so much fun reading this book. It also talks about freedoms and isolation in the way that, especially in the internet age in the 21st century, people don't like to stay put. People usually leave their small hometowns, and so there's a sense of entrapment here. There's also a couple who have moved upstate from New York City, and this town has caught their eye, and so they want to move in. And the locals warn them not to, but they don't really know how to, and they just say, look, you really shouldn't move here. And then they do anyway, and once they do, one of our protagonists has to tell them, okay, so this town is haunted, you're going to see this ghost, she's going to come into your house, and here's the whole backstory, which is a really good way of doing exposition. And then they say, right, we're not staying here, we're moving back, and the locals have to break it to them, you can't do that. You're here now, this is where you live. She is in your blood now. You can't escape her. If you go, she will follow, and we can't let that happen because we keep her a secret. So they are now part of the town, they are part of the haunting. She's a thing that everyone's come to accept, and yet it's hard not to experiment and try and figure out what she is, who she is, how it all works, and that leads to some bad stuff. I really enjoyed Hex, I was so surprised by it. Please check it out. Next, I read The Gingerbread Man by Scottish author Joanna Corrance. This is a book published by the small Edinburgh-based indie publishing house Haunt Publishing. Haunt are absolutely amazing. I've got a few of their books lined up to read next, and they are bringing Scotland and UK-based writers to the forefront, especially those who deal in darker stuff, horror and the gothic. And Gingerbread Man is a really captivating Scottish fairy tale, folk, gothic horror thing. This is another novel that isn't really out and out scary. It is a blend of fairy tale tropes, the gothic, and a few horror elements. It is undeniably very The Shining-esque, and it begins in a really captivating way. It's Christmas. Our protagonist is a man named Eric, who's, I think, around the age of 30, and he's at a Christmas market in Edinburgh. He's with his fiancée. They got engaged really recently, and while they're just looking at stuff, a woman catches his eye through the crowd, and she beckons him over without saying a word. And he leaves his fiancée and wanders over to this woman, gets in a taxi with her, and they drive for hours through the night to an isolated hotel in the Scottish Highlands. She owns this hotel, and now he just lives there with her. He doesn't feel bad about what he's done. He's aware of it, and he's surprised at the fact that he doesn't feel bad. He's surprised at what he did, but he certainly doesn't regret it. It all just felt right and natural to him, and now he's in this hotel. The woman owns it. It is staffed entirely by men. It's always winter there, it's always snowing, it's always cold, and they never have any guests. The woman's name is Delia, and Eric is now her boyfriend. Kind of. As the story goes on, Eric gets to know the men who work at the hotel. He learns their lives. He starts to question why there are never any guests, and figures, well, it's winter, we're in the Highlands, it's very isolated, guests come along in the summer. Apparently people come here to do writing retreats and stuff like that, so it'll be summer eventually. And then it never is. Weeks go by, months go by, nothing changes. And an early thought that I had while reading this is that all of the men who work at the hotel are men who've been lured here by Delia. She casts some kind of spell on men. She lures them in, she calls them her boyfriends, and slowly she convinces them to just do a job at the hotel for her. And you think, right, eventually Eric will become part of the furniture. He will become one of these many men who all work at the hotel. Another fun aspect to the book is that occasionally these men like to sit around and tell horror stories. And so this kind of functions as a short story collection because there are small horror stories just injected into it. And that's just a really fun aspect to it. It kind of reminded me of the novel/short story collection Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk, which is one of the most horrific things you'll ever read. And so this is a dark, modern fairy tale, very similar to something like Hansel and Gretel. You have a woman with some kind of power who lures people in and does dark and bad things to them, even if they're not aware of it. This is very much a fairy tale blended with horror and a gothic setting. There is nothing out and out scary, but there is just this harrowing creepiness to the whole concept, to what is happening to Eric. And I don't want to tell you much more because there are constant revelations and small surprises. Things that you expect to happen do happen, and a few things take you by surprise, especially when it comes to Eric's own actions and the men that he gets to know. Because at first, this is just a blank collection of random guys who work at this hotel, but eventually they become human beings, they become characters, and Eric learns more about them, and what he learns about them will affect him. This is Joanna Corrance writing a brand new fairy tale, a proper Grimm-style fairy tale that I was just so impressed by. And then we have The Whistling by Rebecca Netley. Of these 3 books, this is the scary one. This is the one that actually features more stereotypical, frightening moments. This is a ghost story that will scare you. Or at least it scared me. Being scared means different things to different people. It's amazing how diverse horror is when it comes to its impact on people. I read a lot of horror, I watch a lot of horror, I play a lot of horror video games, and I'm not often chilled or frightened to the point that I want to turn it off or close the book or whatever it is. And that didn't happen to me here, but I certainly felt chilled. I was certainly left cold in a lot of moments. I had goosebumps, and I can imagine that those moments that gave me goosebumps will make other people shut the book. And then there will be other people who don't get affected by it at all. That's the nature of horror. That's how it works. I've mentioned before that my favourite horror movie ever, and the one that frightened me the most, is Ari Aster's Hereditary. I love that film, it's one of my favourites. When I first watched it, I was literally almost crying with fear. At the conclusion, in the 3rd act, when things go absolutely mad inside the house, the style of scares that Ari Aster showed me had me so worked up and frightened I wanted to cry. I was like 28 years old when I watched that film, and I'd never felt fear like it. I talked to a friend of mine who watched it as well, and she also loves horror and watches maybe more horror films than I do, and she laughed. I just can't even imagine that. My point is that horror can take you by surprise, it affects people in different ways, and I have to admit that a good ghost story always has me feeling chilled to the bone. I love slashers, but I don't find them scary at all. Ghost stories are what frighten me. The gothic setting, the haunted house, the things that go bump in the night, that's all I need. Just give me a good ghost story, and that's exactly what The Whistling is. It's set in the 1860s on a remote island off the coast of Scotland. Our protagonist is a woman named Elspeth, and she is the new nanny to a young mute girl who lives in a big house on this island. This girl is called Mary, and she's already seen a lot of tragedy. I don't remember what happened to her father, but her mother died not long ago. Mary is 9 years old, and she's a twin. But her twin brother William is also dead. William, as we learn early on, fell to his death, tumbling off a cliff. So Mary has lost her mother and her twin brother, whom she was very close to. And she had a previous nanny, who was apparently a really decent person, who jumped ship. A trading vessel came along that was headed to the United States, and she went, ooh, new world, new adventures, blah, blah, blah. It's the 1860s, and so she hopped on this ship and off she went. Didn't even say goodbye to the kids. After that, William died, and Mary's left all alone, being raised by her aunt, and she doesn't say a word. Elspeth comes along, and she is very dedicated to befriending Mary, to offering Mary companionship and comfort, and hopefully getting Mary to speak. But there's a lot of darkness here. There's a woman who works at the house called Greer, and she doesn't like Elspeth. She doesn't like anyone. She's very grumpy, and you immediately go, okay, so she's sus. What's going on with her? What's she involved with? There's got to be a reason why she's so grumpy and unlikable, blah, blah, blah. She's got to have a backstory. And she does. And it's a pretty tragic one that you don't learn until much, much later on. And then you've got the haunting, the thing that scares you. It's pretty tropey, but the way that it's expressed is very, very effective. Things go bump in the night. Things get moved around. Elspeth finds these strange little pebbles under her bed. She'll see a handmade doll sitting on her dresser that wasn't there before. And all of these things have meaning. They're not just random things that are put there to go, ooh, and make you feel spooky. There's a reason for the pebbles, there's a reason that it's a doll in particular, there's a reason the doll gets moved. All of these things have purpose, have meaning. And the reason the book is called The Whistling is that there is a whistling. There is some sort of high-pitched whistle noise that kind of feels like a haunting in and of itself. And we learn what might be making this whistling noise and what that might mean, but I don't want to spoil that. The whistle kind of indicates the arrival of a ghostly presence, something that is going to frighten Elspeth, something that is frightening Mary, and something that I found really, really scary early on is that Mary can talk, and she does talk, but only to herself, and only when she's out of earshot. There's a moment early on where Mary and Elspeth are walking along the shore of the island, and Elspeth is looking out to sea, blah, blah, blah. She turns to Mary, and she can see that Mary is sort of whispering something. Elspeth can just see in the distance that Mary's mouth is moving, and she's whispering something, and it looks like she's talking to someone, but there's nobody there. And she learns later on, not too far into the book, that there was a language that Mary and her brother used to speak to each other, a kind of private way for these twins to communicate. And you go, okay, so the ghost is William, right? That's got to be it. And there's so much more. What I really, really liked about this book is the way that it's structured, because the entire point of this book is to scare you. This is a gothic horror ghost story. Plain and simple. And so the way that Rebecca Netley structures it is this. You have pretty short chapters, around 10 pages each, and every chapter serves to provide a revelation. There will be a beginning. Elspeth wakes up and gets on with her day, and as the chapter goes on, we build to some kind of revelation. Something new that we learn, because there is so much here to uncover, so many twists and turns, to the point that you could call this a mystery novel. Or a chapter begins and it builds and builds and builds, night falls, creepy stuff starts to happen, and boom, there's something that makes your blood run cold right at the end. The last line, the last word of the chapter will send a shiver down your spine. That's how every chapter works, one of those two ways. A chapter builds to a revelation where you learn something, and that shocks you, or it builds to a scare that leaves you feeling frightened and nervous and paranoid. And she just repeats that for 300 plus pages over and over again. Build up, and you either get a mystery revealed or a fright. And it's really, really effective. Genuinely, I thought this book was just a very good scare. A chilling ghost story that really, really had me feeling uneasy. And as I said, it's also a kind of mystery because it is full of constant revelations. Elspeth wants to know what's going on. She wants to learn more about the house. Infinite questions about Mary, William, their mother, the previous nanny, the history of the island, blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on and on. There are so many questions, and they all get answered, and they all get nice and neatly tied up. And in the meantime, you will be frightened over and over again. Really good ghost story. Well done to Rebecca Netley. Okay, there you go. 3 really, really good horror novels that I read recently. Similar in some ways, very different in others, and all worth your time. So check these out if you haven't already. Go get scared and subscribe for books.